Well, welcome everybody to this ninth, isn't it amazing, ninth in the series of 10 that we're doing here at the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. Ramona Koval is my name, and it's been my pleasure to be introducing you to these 10 lectures on some of the most important texts in Australian literature, just some of them. There's a lot of other ones as well. Tonight's book is Lilians Story by Kate Grenville. This was her first novel after she published her first collection of short stories called Bearded Ladies in 1984. Later that year, she won the Vogel Prize for this unpublished manuscript by a writer under the age of 35, and she was just under the age of 35, and she rushed it on to send it into the Vogel people before she turned 35. She is the author of 9 novels, a book of short stories, and 4 books about writing. This is what Miriam Kozik, who wrote in the Australian newspaper last year, said about Kate Grenville. Grenville is second only to Nobel Prize winner Patrick White as the most set Australian author on tertiary reading lists. The Secret River is the most frequently set text in English courses. It's taught in 42 units, well ahead of the second place getting Stella Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career, which is taught in 27. Despite this profile, there are those who dismiss her importance. So, but why? I mean, maybe we'll answer that too. Lilian's story is based on the life of one B. Miles. Now, I never met B. Miles. I never saw her because I was always in Melbourne and not in Sydney. But she was born in 1902. She died in 1973. She was an eccentric Sydney-sider who was famous for hijacking taxis and quoting Shakespeare for money. She was the daughter of a Sydney accountant, very well-off people. She ended up, though, going to university, leaving arts at the University of Sydney, saying they did not teach enough Australian stuff. She might have approved of the Wheeler Centre's Auslit series, I think. She has apparently been seen sitting in Sydney banks smoking cigarettes under a sign reading, "Gentlemen will refrain from smoking." She got encephalitis as a young woman. She was committed to a hospital for the insane, Gladesville, when she was also a young woman. She stayed there for a couple of years, and she came out and she lived on the streets. Clive James wrote about his first experience of meeting B. Miles. He says she was the town's most famous eccentric, even more famous than Arthur Stace, the man who wrote Eternity on the streets everywhere. Everyone in Sydney knew that B. Miles was allowed to travel free on public transport. She was just get on and off public transport, get into taxis, refuse to pay, bash up the taxi driver. She looked like, the main reason, he said, was that she kicked up a tremendous fuss if she was asked to pay. She looked like a bag lady minus the bags, but she could kick like the wrestler Chief Little Wolf, uncorking his celebrated flying body slam at Leichhardt Stadium. Everyone had heard of her except me, says Clive James. I tried to sell her a ticket and she went for me. And apparently this went on for quite a long time because young Clive just thought it was his job to sell tickets. Eventually, an inspector got on and explained to Clive James that Miss Miles was an asset to the city and that any attempt to extract a fare from her was like trying to argue with the Harbour Bridge. This is what Kate Grenville herself has said of Lilian's story. It was the stories about the Sydney eccentric B. Miles that led me to write Lilian's story. Every Sydney cabbie, even ones who couldn't have been born when she was in her heyday, have their B. Miles story. Each one swears it was his taxi that she ripped the door off. that it was he who made her take a bath in the Archibald fountain. They all own her history. They've made it by a sort of historical sleight of hand of their own. All I had to do as a novelist was to take some of those stories and extrapolate from them, turning them to my own purposes. Those purposes probably didn't have too much to do with the real B. Miles. What I found interesting in her story was not so much the real woman herself, but more than that, in a time when women were supposed to be the passive objects in the stories of men, she wrote her own story on the blank pages of her city. Tonight we're joined by Susan Sheridan, who is Adjunct Professor of English and Women's Studies at Flinders University. She's published widely on women's writing and feminist cultural studies, Australian cultural history and women's studies. Her latest book is 9 Lives, Post-War Women Writers Making Their Mark, and she recently contributed an essay in a collection on Kate Grenville called Lighting Dark Places. Please make her welcome tonight.
Thank you, Ramona, and thank you everybody for this lovely welcome. I'm honoured to have been invited to take part in this series of lectures. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I'm particularly delighted to have been invited to talk about Lilian's Story, which is one of my very favourite novels. Well, as Ramona has said, this was Kate Grenville's second published book, and it remains, I think, her best known. Perhaps not her most discussed. I think Secret River is probably the most discussed of all great Kate Grenville's novels. But for many, many years it was the best known and perhaps still the best loved, the most universally loved. It didn't raise the kind of the kinds of problems that The Secret River has raised for readers and critics. It's been translated into Swedish, Italian, Czech and French, and it was made into a film in 1995. It is, in some respects, a quintessentially Australian story, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. It's also, as Ramona has indicated, a very Sydney story, so it may have all the more exotic qualities for those of you who've always lived in Melbourne. But one of the things that makes it quintessentially Australian is the sense in which Lilian Singer represents Australia. She was born in the year 1901, the year of Federation. And so in a certain sense, her life traces out the major events of at least the first half of the 20th century in Australia. But despite this, the story has a wide appeal beyond the specifics of our history and culture, because I think it tells the story of a woman who's caught up in the bind that women all over the world can recognise. Lilian Singer is a larger-than-life example of a woman who refuses to conform to the feminine role of passivity and silence that society expects of her, and who pays a high price for her rebellion. She's one of the great eccentrics of Australian fiction. Kate Grenville has said that all her novels are speculative histories and experimental identities. And this is an aspect of her writing that I'll return to towards the end. Speculative histories and experimental identities. And Lilian's Story, she says, is an experiment in imagining how a woman gets to write her own life rather than have it written for her, how a woman gets to turn her back on all the things women are supposed to want and invent another set of priorities, how it feels to be a big, loud, rude, active woman instead of a little, meek, polite one. And as Ramona has told us, her inspiration was B. Miles, that notorious Sydney bag lady who dressed in an army greatcoat, tennis visor and split sand shoes. So she was always immediately identifiable. She'd jump onto buses, as we've heard, or into taxis and give recitations from Shakespeare. But Lilian's Story is by no means a biography. Before doing any research on B. Miles, Kate Grenville says, she wrote several drafts of the book, free associating within the magnetic field, if you like, of the image of a big, powerful woman whose empire was the streets of Sydney. The magnetic field is, I think, a wonderful phrase for this character that she's created, to have her own magnetic field. Now, Lilian, in the story, Lilian needs to be a big, powerful woman. She needs to be strong because her story is a horrific one. As the intelligent and observant daughter of deeply disturbed parents, her father is a domestic tyrant obsessed by his collection of facts, and her mother is intimidated and reclusive. Lilian endures beatings as well as insults from her father, and she begins to eat compulsively to armour her vulnerability. Her younger brother John, by contrast, takes the line of least resistance, pretending deafness and trying to make himself invisible. So you have these two children reacting in diametrically opposed ways to an effectively impossible situation. The story, Lilian's story, takes her, of course, from her childhood right through to her maturity and indeed her dying days as a woman. And it's divided into three parts: childhood, young ladyhood, ironically enough, and then the mature woman. So as a schoolgirl, Lilian longs to be accepted by the other children, and she tries to impress the boys into letting her join their gang by committing deeds of bravery. But a fatso girl can never be a hero in their eyes. That's their term. She spies on her neighbour, a Miss Gash, who is thought to be loony because she paints pictures and sings to herself and sometimes wears trousers and smokes a pipe. You remember this is Sydney in the 1910s. The little girl ridicules Miss Gash in her attempt to impress the other children, so that the cost of her efforts is not only her own repeated humiliation when they reject her, but also the betrayal of a potential friend. Someone, Miss Gash, who offers an alternative to the social conformity that Lilian wants and also despises. As she grows older, Lilian gains a degree of independence. Although consistently failing the tests of young ladyhood, she shines in school exams and wins a place at university. Her father is persuaded to let her accept, since she's obviously not marriage material. At first, she's determined to be a hero, as when she was a child. She says, "I would have liked to be Wilberforce anxious about the slaves, or Dickens bringing tears to everyone's eyes. I would have liked to be Socrates, and was certainly better at asking questions than answering them. I was sure I would not find it hard to be great." At university, she makes friends with Joan, a rebellious girl who recognises Lil as another woman of destiny, in quotes, like herself. And she also befriends two young men. One of them is always known as F.J. Stroud. His little motto is, "I am officially a genius." And another boy called Duncan, with whom she climbs into a tree to swap Shakespeare quotations and sexual lore to escape from genteel tennis parties. But Lilian becomes disillusioned with university. The men in tweed, as she calls them, her lecturers, give out facts, like her father, of course, but not wisdom. Wisdom is what she wanted. But the life of the senses is more appealing to her now. But her naive moves towards sexual self-discovery are misunderstood by her mates. Worse, they are exploited by her monstrous father, whose name is Albion. He's salaciously curious about what she gets up to with these men, her beaux, as he scornfully calls them. He refuses to believe her answer, which is, "We get up to Shakespeare." Not long after that, he comes across Lilian naked in front of the mirror and rapes her. Lilian is unable to speak to her mother or even her friends about this violation. She goes bush alone. She returns home and begins to roam the streets at night, the only form of rebellion left to her. Her father, who's no longer able to threaten her with beatings, has her committed to a mental hospital and leaves her there for years. Nevertheless, Lilian isn't broken into feminine submissiveness. She makes friends with the other women in the loony bin, as she calls it. Although she says, and I quote, "There were times when confusion overwhelmed me and frightening sobs tore themselves up from deep in my chest, and I rocked from side to side with my pain." But eventually her Aunt Kitty, the dipsomaniac, her father's sister, rescues her by blackmailing Albion into paying an allowance for Lilian to live on. So she emerges from the institution and learns to live alone in King's Cross in a little room in the heart of Sydney's Bohemia. She proves herself to be larger than her trauma, recovering her eagerness to experience life in all its facets. She takes on her role as the bard. Remember, singer is her surname. She recites Shakespeare. She travels for free around the city, just as B. Miles did. And she looks for love, her phrase, like the strippers and transvestites, the prostitutes and drunks who live around her. And there's a hilarious episode where she pursues a banker for whom she's conceived a passion, and she's sure, of course, that he has reciprocates this and is leaving her magical signs. I'll tell you more about that later. Anyway, this pursuit of the banker leads her eventually to find her old mate, F.J. Stroud, Frank, again. And he too has become a denizen of the city parks and streets. And as loving companions, they set up an oddball kind of home together in a stormwater tunnel. After his death, she weeps for Frank and for her loneliness, but she tells herself, "It is my time in the wilderness. I will be content with that, even if I cannot be happy." Her lust for life is unbeatable, even in grief. Giving up her ambition to be a hero in the masculine mould, she creates herself as a person of note in her own terms. "I have always been my own destiny," she says, "and loved my inventions of myself." She has freed herself to make these inventions as transgressive and crazy as she likes. She takes positive delight in disconcerting other people. "Dignity and respect are humbug," she declares. Other women in the novel, though, echo her rebellion against patriarchal society. There's Miss Gash that I've told you about. There's Joan, her friend at university. There's Aunt Kitty. There are the women in the loony bin and the sex workers at the cross. Lilian is the greatest of these rebels, but she's not alone. Lilian's story is nevertheless profoundly shaped by her father's abuse. In her narrative, he is always father with a capital F, suggesting the symbolic significance of his role as the patriarch attempting to subdue the female whose sexuality he both despises and fears. The father's rape almost succeeds in silencing her. When she tries to tell her mother what has happened, she says, "I could not start the sentence. My mouth and tongue were someone else's now, and even the words that rose to my mind had nothing to do with me. Whatever had happened, and I would not ask myself just what it had been, had happened to a mass of flesh called Lilian, not to me." So you can see she's beginning to dissociate herself from herself. The father's rape is an attempt to punish her for her burgeoning sexuality and also to punish her for her powers of speech, which assert her independence of him. She uses Shakespeare's poetry as a weapon against him. She responds to his scornful laughter at her remarkable capacity to recite. And in this scene, just before the rape, she fixes her gaze on she's being cross-questioned by her father across his desk. She fixes her gaze on the roses outside the window of his study and begins to recite. "Then I could not stop, but felt my mouth shaping word after word, faster and faster, and on those hated pink roses saw page after page slipping over thick with words. 'Stop, Lilian, stop!' I heard father shouting, and felt his hands on my shoulders. 'Shut up, Lilian!' When he slapped my face, I saw startled points of light before my eyes, and a great ringing began in my ear." Her father Albion's response here might recall for us a similar scene of daughterly disobedience in Christina Stead's great novel, The Man Who Loved Children, and I understand that was one of the novels that you've heard about in this series. And if you know that novel, you'll remember that Louis, the daughter, invents a special language in which to write the play Herpes Rom, the Snake Man or Father, in which she dramatises the daughter's feeling of being suffocated by her father's intrusive presence. It's tantamount to an account of incest, one of those taboo subjects that Kate Grenville says she often chooses to write about. The daughter's defiance, her invention of a language to say what cannot be spoken in ordinary language, can be read as a symbolic act of cultural defiance. And similarly, Lilian learns to command a special eloquent language, Shakespeare's language, with which to defy her father and reach out to the rest of the world. Although Albion destroys her volume of Shakespeare, he drowns it in the harbour, and ironically this was a gift from him to her when she was a child, before she became such a threat to him. She says, "It didn't matter, because I had enough of it in my head to last a lifetime." This opposition of speech and silence is one of several pairs of terms that shape the novel Lilians Story, and there's also what I'd call a pair of terms, presence and performance. Now, many of us who've seen the film of Lilian's Story will have the image of Ruth Cracknell as Lilian before our eyes, if you remember that. But when we read the novel, we're made constantly aware of Fat Lilian, growing her defences as a girl and retaining that bulk in maturity so that she becomes, in her words, a fine figure of a woman. She also revels in her capacity to capture an audience, from the time she's a little girl reciting for her mother's friends to her Shakespeare recitations and enforced conversations with people in buses and taxis, when she makes the streets of Sydney her territory. So both as a massive presence, physical presence, and as an exhibitionist performer, Lilian demands to be noticed and insists on others acknowledging her existence. Her presence and her performances might remind us, often chillingly, of how far we might be driven by our human need for recognition, for the attention of others, even if it's the attention of mockery or disgust. A third important opposition in this novel is between imprisonment and mobility. Lilian feels imprisoned in her father's house for many years, and then she is literally incarcerated in the loony bin, and later in jail briefly. Metaphorically, she's imprisoned by other people's expectations of her, at least as a girl. Yet she always finds a way to resist, whether it's climbing a tree to escape from the garden party, or walking the streets all night, or travelling around in other people's taxis. The taxis bring her two great pleasures, mobility and performance, together at the same time. Mobility is the key, is one of her mottos. And no one looking for love can afford not to journey, is another of her favourite sayings. What's more, her mobility and her size together constitute a major claim to public space. Instead of being intimidated by the dangers of walking at night alone in the city, as most women are, Lilian takes back the night, to use that phrase of the feminist movement. She takes back the night for herself. She's preoccupied with her place in history, moving on from her youthful dreams of heroism. As a mature woman, she says, "I was beginning to be a public figure and enjoying it, the way people nudged each other and pointed. My story was beginning to have a part in the stories of others, and I was becoming a small part of history." And to a certain extent, as I suggested, her story could be read as an allegory of 20th century Australia. She's born to a father named Albion, which is an old name of England, in 1901, the year of Federation. Her birth is attended by portents worthy of a Shakespearean drama. Horses kicked down their stables, pigs flew, figs grew thorns. This is the beginning of the novel. Her struggle against paternal authority and social conformity takes her through the historical events of 2 world wars and the Depression. When her father torments her with his visits while she's shut up in the lunatic asylum, Lilian thinks, "Father seemed to have vanquished me, but I knew I was biding my time. I am biding my time," I said to myself, behind my impermeable envelope of skin. I knew that I had a head start on Father, that I was young and strong with years of nourishment and walking, while he was old, or would be soon, and was weakened under that brittle carapace of his by all his underground passions. The critic Dorothy Jones points out that Lilian, in this role as symbolising Australia, is a great comic creation. She develops into a character who's part larrikin, part monster. She writes, "Through her eccentricity, she becomes a touchstone to test the adequacy, courage and goodwill of those who cross her path, as she's incorporated into the life of both Sydney and Australia. And I'd add, as a woman who goes bush to escape her family, she parodies those men who traditionally have taken the path with their swag and their billy can. Just as in claiming her right to inhabit the city streets, she parodies the role claimed by male bohemians who rejected suburban domestic life. So this perspective on the novel draws out its significance as a statement about Australian culture, a critical statement about its gender relations and colonial relationship to England. But what's crucial, I think, is the emphasis on the comic energy of Grenville's creation. Surely that's why a novel that tells of such horrifying incidents as incest and incarceration can offer us such pleasure as readers. Grenville said that Lilians Story was an intensely enjoyable novel to write. She says, although Lilian is bent by what is done to her, she's never broken. She recreates herself not in the image that culture expects of women, but in the image she chooses for herself. She seizes with both hands every joy and adventure offered to her, and in the end she, not her father, is the powerful one. At the end of her life, after experiencing love as well as hate, delight as well as despair, she can say, "I am ready for whatever comes next." They're the final words of the novel. So the power of the novel, I think, is the power of Lilian's presence. The book is made up of mostly short scenes, almost cinematic. They're very brief and vivid. They're diverse enough to suggest a whole world peopled by many other characters, places, sights and sounds. But all these scenes or fragments in life are held together by the energy of Lilian's being, of her lust for life. So we might ask, how does the novelist create this presence, this energy? In particular, I think it's Grenville's achievement of a narrative voice for Lilian, telling her own story, a voice that's quite inimitable, quite distinctive, a voice that calls the world into being, and it's a world in which she occupies central position, even when she's being persecuted by others. Kate Grenville described the process of discovering Lilian's voice as a realisation that, she said, the voice she spoke with was the voice I wanted to write in. I knew I was going to enjoy that voice. And I think the voice is a triumph. It has great range from the cruelest humiliations when Lilian cannot speak to anyone, but at least can tell her story for herself, right through to the unstoppable, bawdy, boisterous Lil Singer the Bag Lady, Queen of the Streets. For much of her early life, she suffers horribly for her nonconformity, her intransigence. Here she is, I'm going to read a passage to you of Lilian as a young girl, excruciatingly aware of her difference from others, but still hoping for the best, this energetic person. Listen. At the tennis parties for the young folk on the serene lawns and courts of Kissing Point Road, I was the fat girl who looked like coconut ice when she blushed. I had not been kissed at any point. There is actually a place in Sydney off the Lane Cove River called Kissing Point. In the shade under the jacaranda, white cloth tables were spread with food, and there I could at least console myself with another slice of cream pie. I surreptitiously eased the satin sash, choking my waist, and stood legs astride to feel the cool air between my thighs. I had to prickle and sweat under layers of silk and white stockings that did their best to suffocate me. I had never seen myself smile. There was nothing in the mirror when I stood in front of it to make me smile. Others smiled. I saw them out of the corner of my eye, smiling. But I was a person of brains and still hoped for the best. She's bright, of course, I heard the mothers tell each other as they fanned themselves under the jacarandas. She's ever so clever. I gulped down the last of my cream pie and filled my mouth with noisy ginger beer, but nothing could stop me from hearing, "It's just as well," some mother said languidly and loudly enough to carry. "Is she feeding those brains of hers, do you think?" The tinkling of so many titters and their faces all turned towards me behind their fans drove me like a thwarted cow back out of the shade and onto the terrible sunlit stage of the lawn. Well, it's quite a long quotation, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things about it. And first off, Grenville's style, the way it draws us in with an evocative, sensuous detail of the sight, the sound, sensations to the sensation of a hot day, uncomfortable clothes. And then the way she brings us close to Lilian, in sympathy with her plight, but at the same time, the humour of the narrative sets us at some distance from the girl. In fact, we're not allowed to feel sorry for her, the girl who looked like coconut ice when she blushed. This passage, dominated by the watching eyes that Lilian tries to hide from, captures this period of her life as a girl. And later, as a grown woman, we see her reverse the process and display herself instead of hiding. Instead of feeling driven like a cow, an ungainly dumb animal, onto the terrible sunlit stage, the woman, known as Mad Lil Singer, creates stages for herself in the streets of the city. She puts herself in the spotlight and turns the tables on the judgmental watchers of this world, embarrassing them. And this is the passage I promised you of Lil in pursuit of her great love, this man that she spies on the streets of Sydney. She calls him Lord Kitchener because he has a very fine moustache and a commanding presence. She has tried to engage him in conversation, for, as she asks herself, what is love without the thrust and parry, the approach and retreat of the plumed male? But he ignores her, refusing to play the part that she has ordained for him. So she goes for a more direct approach. Listen. "At the quay, I was lying in wait for him on the boat, and he did not see me as I took my place behind him. So close that one corner of his oxblood briefcase nudged my knee. so close that by pursing my lips I could make the hair on the back of his neck flutter. When the boat hit the wharf and everyone staggered, he staggered too, and for a glorious moment I embraced him. His back was pressed against my breast. My nostrils were full of the hot animal smell of his hair. I was almost able to join my hands in front of his chest, and for several endless seconds he remained in my embrace. "Ah," I whispered into his ear. Even I had no words for such ecstasy. It's a kind of comedy, I think, that works by excruciation. We hear the account in Lilian's words. We can fully imagine the man's embarrassment at this encounter. We're simultaneously with her, caught up in her obsessive love and her moment of triumph, and with him as the object of her unwanted attentions, surrounded by crowds of amused onlookers. And then Lilian's voice can also convey her dreams, her innermost self, something like her creator's imagination. Here's another passage. This is in the King's Cross, when she lives in King's Cross. "Summer nights in my room were full of the yearning scents of jasmine and the keening of mosquitoes and the shouts of other hot people abusing each other. On such nights, the thought of another body next to mine was unbearable, and I had no envy for all the couples in all the rooms behind their walls, tangled, hot and cross in sticky sheets. On those nights, I often left my room, excited as if going to meet a lover, and perhaps even the tall man I felt must be waiting for me somewhere, and strolled down the hill. I walked through the streets, full of the sounds of lives that floated out so many open windows, down to my summer residence, the cool stormwater channel in the park between the black trees. The hollow clatter of metal shrouds against the masts of all those quiet boats was like music across the water, random, endless, soothing. Like the lives of people, the music of the masts was something complicated and mysterious and composed of the clearest and most simple threads. But Lilian's voice too can convey the grief of abandonment and the terror of formlessness and panic. When Lord Kitchener disappears into his bank and she can no longer make any claim on him, Lilian sits outside on a bench, and I quote, "snuffing up the air in great gulps so that people stared and visibly wondered if the fat woman was having an attack. I am not sick," I called when I had enough breath to speak. "There is nothing wrong with me but love, and I am ready to die for that." But, and this is further testimony to the tragi-comic power of the novel, Lil is not required to die for love, though she never ceases to look for it. She has many different ways to dramatise herself. She never gets stuck in any one role. "It is better to travel hopefully," is her most frequent saying. And she concludes, "In the absence of love, a laugh was not bad to be going on with." Kate Grenville once said that, "I write as a way of exploring issues I don't understand. Writing about something is my way of thinking about it. And in my early novels, the things I didn't understand were the things about women." And then she went on, "Writing is a permitted way of exploring taboo subjects or taking seriously subjects that are usually trivialised. And writing is a way of making visible the invisible biases of our culture." As a young woman, Kate writes, she was appalled to realise the extent to which women were distorted or were obliged to distort themselves to fit the moulds of womanhood that the culture sets for them. And in this novel, like the other early novels, she found a way of thinking this through. But she achieves more, I think, than a critique of women's oppression by inventing a character, Lilian, who shines through all her trials and suffering as the maker of her own story. As Lilian herself puts it, "I, large, plain, frightening to others and sometimes to myself, have taken the past and the present into myself." She has made herself up, created her own self, written her own original script and lived by it. And now that she feels herself to be near to death, she says, "My flesh will become still one day soon, but my name will live in the different kinds of smiles on the faces of people remembering me, and that is enough immortality for me." Remember, she said, I'll quote this again, "I've always been my own destiny and loved my inventions of myself." And I think Lilian testifies to the difficulty and as well to the urgent necessity for a woman to make herself up, to write her own story. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. As usual, we're going to have a couple of people with microphones who are just coming down the sides here. So as soon as you've thought of your question, you just raise your hand and wait till the microphone gets to you. Could I, just before we take a question...
Yes.
That scene, you know, the rape scene, the way she's written that is really... it's coming from a very sort of funny angle, because you read it and then you think, well, what's happened? I don't really understand. You have to reread it. I mean, it's as if she's trying to write about dissociation, trying to write one step away from what actually happens. How do we understand that scene?
It's all in the build-up. It's Lilian's alone. She thinks she's alone in the house, and she wanders around the house. She does all the things that are forbidden. She goes into her father's study. She goes into her mother's wardrobe, and she takes off all her own clothes, and she's sitting there on the floor in front of the mirror and admiring herself, feeling completely in her own body, and sexually so, I think it's suggested. And Albion appears and towers over her and overpowers her. Shall I find that passage? It's I mean, I think that what Grenville's doing there is making the choice not to describe a horrific event in extremely close terms, but she doesn't need to, really, because she suggested the horrible contrast between this moment of really ecstasy that Lilian has by herself and then this lowering presence which then comes upon her. Let me just find it, and I'll... So it's... in the previous scene where she recites Shakespeare at him, she's constantly defiant, and he shuts her up by hitting her. In this one, she's communing silently with herself, and he shuts her up by raping her. Let me just...
I should have found it myself before I even raised the issue.
No, that's
my
all
fault.
right. We can find it. Yeah. Father filled the doorway before I could break apart and fly free of my body. All sound was drawn away into the tiles and past the windows. I watched as everything else and Father and I were left. I watched as everything else fled and Father and I were left with each other. The brown buttons of the cardigan that Mother had given him made a small tinny noise like rat's feet as he took it off and let it drop on the floor. I mean, there's also this kind of weird domestic detail of a brown cardigan. In every room of the house, the air that I had stilled fled and was replaced by trembling and fearful vibrations. I could hear my voice, a thin, reedy cry, like something choking and not being rescued. Father said nothing at all, but the sound of his breathing was like a thudding machine in the silence. All around us, the house stood shocked, repelling the sounds that we made. My cries carried no further than the carpet of the stairway. The silent rooms would take no part in my struggle, but swallowed the sounds indifferently. No, I heard myself cry, with a feeble piping sound. No, no. The house gave back only silence and the panting of the desperate machine that was Father. That's it.
It's quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a question.
Is this question here?
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, but to begin, in reference to this, my worry, even in the passage you've spoken for us, is that the author shifts between objective and subjective. There's no way she can possibly know how far that carpet extends, or the sound that gets so far as the edge of the carpet, no further. What worries me about that is that later in that novel, as I recall, I haven't read it for some time, she insists and indeed offers to demonstrate to others that her hymen is still intact. That's when she's an older woman. So I don't understand, by rape you don't mean penetration then, is that it?
Well, we don't know, but what happens... But you're right, the whole book is entirely from Lilian's subjective point of view.
Yes.
And that was my point about how the book is carried by Lilian's voice. So we must take Lilian's word for it. We must, and we therefore get to experience the world somewhat as Lilian does.
But do we take her word as an old lady or as the girl who's narrating that scene? Because I was confused by that too when I read it again, saying, why is she saying she's a virgin? Or is this part of her displacement? That other Lilian isn't a virgin, but this Lilian is.
Yes, because and she says she displaces herself. She says all of that happened to a mass of flesh called Lilian, not to me. So later on in the novel, this is how I would interpret that scene when she's talking to the sex workers and says, "I am a virgin." She's partly imagining herself as Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, because that's been one of her childhood fantasies. But she's also, I think, saying that violation didn't touch the innermost me, the me that I experience as Lilian, not. So it's a form of dissociation, certainly.
Thank you. I had something to comment, but I needed to ask that question first. Can I go on with the comment? Yeah. Which goes like this. I lived in East Sydney for years. These days they call it Wolloomooloo and King's Cross, but it was East Sydney. Beatrice Miles, and we always addressed her as Beatrice. This B. Miles is some invention that's come up from people subsequently, the myth makers. Now, one of the things about Beatrice in the time, and my kids were born there, they knew her, they addressed her as Beatrice, was that she wore the 10-shilling note with a big safety pin on her jacket. Now, this was so the coppers couldn't grab her for vagrancy. Now, that doesn't come anywhere in that I find in the book. I just wonder how much research the author of the novel wanted to make or needed to. And adding to that was that there are references in a couple of places in the novel to her going to the movies. Now, I was a movie person, and I think Ramona probably recognises me by now.
Klaus.
Yeah, and some people recognise that in the movie version of this novel, I played Frank Stroud. But that she went to the first screenings, like on the Thursday of each week, the first release cinemas. Yes, Beatrice did.
Wow.
So she was at the first screening of Limelight, High Noon, Cry the Beloved Country, these ones and Wonderful Country. These were ones that I would go to, the 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, the first screening. Beatrice was always there. Now, sometimes she would light up in the pictures, and people have to go and say, but she didn't like Limelight for whatever reason and was ejected because she kept yelling out, "Rats, rats!" And eventually a couple of people, whom I presume were officials, pulled her out of the joint. Now, the reason I want to put that down is because I'm struggling with Kate Grenville's novel in a number of places. I've taken, you see, I wonder how much... And in a sense, your reply to my first question is part and answer to this, how much she expects us to do our own constructing on what she's given us. For instance, Lord Kitchener, it seems to me, is her father. That if you remember the Kitchener, and then the Kitchener was in the posters, you know, the "I Want You" of World War One.
Yes.
And then the description she gives of her father, how proudly he is with his uniform, etc. So that are we meant, and this is a question now, are we meant to make those constructions ourselves or not?
Well, can I say, just before you answer, this is something else that Kate Grenville said about history and research and what she was doing. She said, "Writing Lilian's Story gave me a taste for rewriting history for my own purposes. With Joan Makes History, I went the whole hog. It was supposed to be a parodic history of Australia, our history remade in the image of the women rather than the men. I was indignant with history. On behalf of all the women it belittled or bypassed. I thought I agreed with Ford that history was bunk. I came to mock history but stayed to pray."
Pray, not praise.
Pray. She says, "My epiphany, albeit a humbling one, was reading Manning Clark. He was a historian not hiding behind a mask of objectivity, but being shamelessly personal. If I thought in my ignorance that I was going to put the story back into his story, I had to recognise that he had already done it with a breadth of vision and depth of knowledge no novelist could match." So she's doffing her hat to him. But would you like to answer the question, which is really what are we to make of what she's trying to do with history?
Well, yeah, I think that's one of the questions you're asking. But the other one was, I think, more about the psychology of the novel, the understanding of Lilian, wasn't it? The strong association between Lord Kitchener and her father, the mustachioed men who hold themselves
and
well,
the banker.
And the banker. I think it's obviously it's no accident, and I think if we see those connections, then in many ways it deepens our sense of the impossible bind that this kind of abuse puts Lilian in, that she's both tied to an image of masculinity that comes from her father, and yet she also never puts herself quite in a position where she might have to directly encounter it. So by making herself into this grotesque, this bag lady, the story that she tells of a secret love that she follows through the streets is also a way of ensuring that she doesn't actually have to encounter this man as a person, as a man. You know, he's a symbol. Does that help to sort that?
That's partly helping.
Oh, no, John, can we just wait? Just to hear there's somebody else? Yeah, we'll come back to you.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the rape scene you've mentioned. Lilian was older then. She had a bit more consciousness. I'm just wondering what you think of the idea that he in fact had started this abuse when she was quite young. That in the study, you know, over and she ate and ate to protect herself. There is too much flesh for him now, she said, too much flesh for him now. And I remember teaching this soon after it was first published, and we had great discussions in the staff room about this. And it seems to me that at that stage, Lilian was quite young and she was unaware of what sexual abuse was, and in fact the abuse started then. And I think that he was such a monster, he'd actually abused Kitty as well, with what Kitty had said to Lilian's mother. So I'm just wondering, you know...
Kitty, his sister.
The sister, yeah. His sister, yes.
The dipsomaniac.
That's right. And, you know, what was he like now? Is he heavy? He always was. She says to the mother, as though she has experienced this from this horrible man as well.
Well, you know, I think Grenville gives us hints of this kind that we can join the dots if we wish or not. I mean, she is, after all, inventing these characters and inventing this family situation, although she would have been very aware of the discussions that began to become public only, I think, in the late 70s and early 80s about the extent of family sexual abuse, particularly of girl children. And so she has, as you'll remember, she has Lilian, Albion beats Lilian, makes her pull down her drawers and bend over so that he can beat her. I think, you know, if you want, it's perfectly possible to read that symbolically as a form of rape. It is certainly abuse. And the suggestion that there's also a suggestion too. You're right that he has had a particular his sister Kitty has a particular hold over him. It's when Lilian, as a little girl, is hiding under the sideboard, she realises that he's wailing to his wife, "Why does Kitty humiliate me like this?" And he's actually weeping. And then when he realises that his little daughter is underneath the sideboard, listening to him, witnessing him breaking down like this, that's when he hauls her out and locks the door of his study and beats her for the first time. So yeah, there are lots of suggestions that there is this, I suppose, this classic structure of an abusive man, but it's not... when Grenville says that her novels are experiments in thinking something through, I think what she wants to do is not try to understand the pathology scientifically, but to understand it emotionally and how it engages all the people who are involved in such a relationship.
Including from Albion's point of view, where she writes Dark Places afterwards.
Yes.
So it's just, she's doing the thought experiment to its nth degree, not just to the one that's a bit easier to understand,
That's
Lilian,
right. That's
but
right.
to her father.
Yeah. So she said she loved writing Lilian, but then she felt that to be truthful, to be consistent, she really had to think through that same situation from Albion's point of view. And she went on to write her next novel, Dark Places, entirely through the consciousness of Albion, which I think was an extraordinarily brave and difficult thing to do. And I think it's in a sense her most neglected novel because it's so hateful. You know, it really turns your stomach. But it also too has a terrible kind of grotesque power about it. And I think that's the nature of her thought experiments, is to imagine herself in and around these characters who do unthinkable things, unspeakable things. That's the task she sets herself. And it's similar to the task that she set herself in The Secret River, of course, of understanding how the settler William Thornton could have ultimately taken part in the massacre of Aboriginal people on the Hawkesbury. She felt she had to not only think it through, but imagine it through and feel it through. And I think that's an extraordinarily important role that fiction can play. I'm with her on that count.
Yes, down the front here.
Given how sad and painful her story is, do you think she really succeeded in inventing herself?
Yes, I do, and that's why I tried to choose examples to quote to that gave Lilian both that took full account of her suffering, but also gave her as this unstoppable, almost a force of nature. And I think it is a high price to pay to make herself into this person who was admired and loved by many people. They told stories about her. That was the immortality she wanted, but she never did find love. You know, she says, "I'm all looking for love," and that never quite happened. So, you know, I think it's. I don't think Kate Grenville. She does romanticise her somewhat as this free spirit, but she doesn't make it all okay. You know, she puts Lilian's suffering out there undeniably as well. Doesn't quite answer your question, I suppose, but.
When you do, I'll just come back to you in a second, John, but when you do a reading of the same book, I mean, we're talking about somebody making of themselves something after this event in her life which causes her to dissociate, and then you do a reading of it which says it's about Australia. It starts off at 1901 and Albion is the father. I mean, well, what is the function of the rape scene if you're doing a reading of it as the story of Australia?
Well, you can't do a parallel at every point. It's not an allegory in that respect. It's just that there are these elements, I suppose, of
You're just supposed to note it, but rather than.
I think so. Yes, you're not supposed to be able to say, "Oh, and this corresponds to the rape corresponds to World War II or something." No, not like that. It's sort of juxtaposing, I suppose, this classic. Story of womanhood and the distortions of womanhood, or someone avoiding those, just with enough social and cultural history to make Lilian what she wanted to be, which was part of history, to make her story part of other people's stories.
John, you have to wait for
Thank you. Yeah, there we are. Thanks. I'm unhappy with the style of the novel because I find Kate Grenville to be inconsistent in her chosen methods, and she compromises the whole notion of first-person narrative by commencing the novel with events that she could not have witnessed.
You're a stickler.
No, not entirely stickler, but what worries me is that she shifts in and out of sometimes the what I've heard referred to as the interior journey. But to me, the interior is not the same as insight. I don't get the insight. When her father is violating her in whatever form that takes, that we're calling rape, that she says no, she echoes her mother. Her mother, no, Albion, no. But these are the things that you see. Well, it's the kind of licence that a novelist who's being easy on herself or himself does. They give themselves licence to shift between one discipline and another. And I
But that's what a novel is, isn't it?
No,
she can do whatever she likes.
Yeah, of course you can do what you like, but she's not going to win my admiration unless, like a woman, an author such as Gertrude Stein, that having set that discipline, she sticks to it.
Oh, Gertrude Stein, God, you're a stickler for punishment.
I don't agree with you that she slips in and out of it, that she attributes to Lilian things that Lilian couldn't know. As a little girl, she says, I could hear them in the room below mine, or whatever. The only passage that happens without Lilian's consciousness being there is, of course, the passage that describes her birth. So you could, if you saw that just as a prologue to the whole novel, and that's the bit where it says,
but
horses broke out of their stables and pigs flew.
Her telling you about, she was bound for glory because look what happened
she can make up her own
birth.
She can make up her own birth as well. She doesn't have an I in that passage, but it's true. Yes, she claims the right, I suppose, to imagine this heroic moment of her birth too. I suppose your questions make me realise that I probably didn't emphasise enough the mode of the novel in the grotesque, in the exaggerated, in the Gothic. It's not a realist novel at all. It's not only an interior novel from Lilian's subjective consciousness, but also everything that Lilian sees is heightened and distorted by both her desire to grasp the world and make it her own, but also her inability to play the social games by the rules that we're all supposed to learn. So the whole novel has a very, I suppose, if you don't like it, you could say a kind of overheated quality to it. But to me, I think that if you like that approach, it makes everything is extremely vivid. It is like I think some of Patrick White's early work, where people didn't really speak to one another in that way, or people don't often speak in that formal way that Lilian does when she makes her declarations. But it's the license that a novelist takes to give the whole work, I think, a sort of a consistent degree of exaggeration and grotesqueness, because that's the vision of the Lilian character.
A consistent degree, you say?
I think it's consistently over the top, if you like. It's consistently grotesque. All the people, they're a bit like Dickens characters, that have got wild eccentricities or very strange appearance or whatever.
We've got one more question here. I think we've got time for one more.
I think that, I was not present when my parents met, but I've been told that story, and it's part of my mythology, my history, and I can tell you how they met. I will be telling you a first-person narrative of how my parents met. I wasn't there, but I can still tell that story. And I think the important thing is she is telling her history. I mean, I haven't read the book. I'm just going from what you've said. She's telling her story, and she is remaking her story. So why does she have to stop at her birth? Or from her earliest memory. Why can't she just keep going back? Why can't she remake her parents' meeting? She can reinvent anything. It sounds like there's a bit of magical realism in this and in the whole story. So, she could go back as far as she wants. It's her story. She is remaking it in order to make herself the person she wants to be. So she has that freedom, I would think.
Well, can you imagine? We've come to the end. It's an hour's just gone by very quickly tonight. And I wanted to, just before we say thank you to Susan Sheridan, just to let you know that next week, the final in this series, on the 17th of May, the final lecture is we're going to be looking at Kim Scott's novel, That Dead Man Dance, and our lecturer is going to be Philip Morrissey, who's the academic coordinator of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne in the Faculty of Arts. So join us again then. Bring all your friends for the last in this series, but please thank Susan Sheridan for her splendid lecture.